Good evening, everyone. I'm Laura Catoni Godwin, President-elect of the Holy Cross Alumni Association and a proud member of the class of 1996. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Holy Cross Martin Luther King Jr. Winter Book Read panel discussion. The HCAA is thrilled to partner with the Office of the College Chaplains, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Office of Multicultural Education on this important programming initiative. Tonight, we'll take a deep dive into Father Bryan Massingale's groundbreaking book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church. The Holy Cross campus community has participated in the MLK Winter Book Read and subsequent discussions for many years now. This, however, is the first year that this common read has been extended to the alumni community. We are pleased with the alumni response to this invitation and delighted to have so many of you with us here tonight. We have a wonderful panel of Holy Cross faculty, staff, and alumni with us. We are so grateful for their willingness to share their knowledge and experiences, and of course, for their involvement. Before we turn it over to them, I want to introduce tonight's moderator, Amit Tanahija, Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Amit provides leadership on a number of Holy Cross institutional priorities, including faculty and staff hiring and curricular development. He works collaboratively with office and departments to infuse mission-driven principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the campus. Thank you for moderating tonight's discussion, Amit.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good evening and welcome to all the attendees. As Laura said, this is our sixth year doing the MLK Winter Book Read. It's our opportunity to put students, faculty, and staff in conversation with one another. My bad that we didn't think about actually inviting alumni in, but now I feel with Zoom, we've become more comfortable to create more opportunities. So while we lament the ill effects of the pandemic, this may be maybe new doors have opened for us to connect. So welcome everybody. We had over 240 alumni who signed up to read the book. So we love that we're spreading the message outwards. I also want to add my thanks to the Office of Alumni Relations, to the Holy Cross Alumni Association, who did a lot of work to put this event together, and particularly my colleagues Tom Cadigan and Erica Mendoza from Office of Alumni Relations, who have been instrumental in organizing the event. I also want to recognize and welcome members of the alumni community and members of the Board of Trustees who are with us today. So thank you for being here. I'll start off by introducing our panelists. So we have 4 panelists today. We're very lucky to have them. We have Dean Michele Murray, who serves as the Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at the college. We have Professor Mary Doyle Roche, class of 90, and she's the Associate Professor and Department Chair for the Department of Religious Studies. Next, we have Alex Mikulich, who from the class of 1984. He's a Catholic theologian and ethicist, and we're very fortunate to have him. And last but not least, we have Marybeth Kearns-Barrett from the class of 1984 and director of the Office of College Chaplains. So I'm in good company here today. We thought in order to get us started, we might take a moment of contemplation and a moment of prayer to center us all into a space where we can be present for this conversation. And with that, I'd like to invite Marybeth to offer us an opening prayer.
Good evening, thank you. I've chosen a selection that's actually found in Father Massingale's book from W.E.B. Du Bois' A Litany at Atlanta, which he wrote following a racial massacre that occurred there in 1906. O silent God, thou whose voice afar in mist and mystery hath left our ears a-hungered in these fateful days, hear us, good Lord. A city lay in travail, God our Lord, and from her loins sprang twin murder and black hate. Red was the midnight, clang, crack, and cry of death, and fury filled the air and trembled underneath the stars when church spires pointed silently to thee. And all this to sate the greed of greedy men who hide behind the veil of vengeance. Bend us thine ear, O Lord. Bewildered are we and passion tossed, mad with madness of a mobbed and mocked and murdered people, straining at the armposts of thy throne. We raise our shackled hands and charge thee, God, by the bones of our stolen fathers, by the tears of our dead mothers, by the very blood of thy crucified Christ. What meaneth this? Tell us the plan. Give us the sign. Keep not thou silence, O God. Sit no longer blind, Lord God, deaf to our prayer and dumb to our dumb suffering. Surely thou too art not white, O Lord, a pale, bloodless, heartless thing. Ah, Christ of all the pities. Forgive the thought, forgive these wild, blasphemous words. Thou art still the God of our Black fathers. But whisper, speak. Call, great God, for thy silence is white terror to our hearts. The way, O God, show us the way and point us to the path. Tempt us not beyond our strength. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for that. So the panelists got together before this event and we were trying to figure out a way to sort of launch the conversation. And we thought it would be important to not just talk about race and racism and white privilege in the abstract, but to actually situate it in some of our lived experiences as well. So with that, I'm going to invite both Dean Murray and Marybeth Kearns-Barrett to share, to get us started, share a personal story, respectively on racism and white privilege to help situate our conversation today. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dean Murray.
Thank you, Ahmed. This is a little bit about my own history with racism. I could tell you about all the times from my early years that I've been called the N-word or some other derogatory name. I could tell you about the times when I've been followed in a store or questioned about my presence in any given place. I could tell you about the teachers who discounted my abilities, or how each slight and insult made it that much more difficult for me to learn to be proud of who I am. Instead, I will tell you of a moment that a friendship, such that it was, died. To this day, almost 30 years later, I can feel the abandonment of the moment, and the humiliation still rises in me, and the roots of my hair still tingle with hot anger. I was invited to a white friend's home for a family dinner. In the middle of the meal, a brother-in-law cracked a racist joke using the N-word. The entire table grew quiet. No one, not even my friend, aided me. When the meal was over, people, including my friend, immediately jumped up to clear the dishes, leaving me to defend myself alone with a man who had used the N-word in front of me because he forgot I was there. The sin of racism suddenly exposed in the private banter of white people, and the learned helplessness or cowardice of people who could have intervened but chose not to. This, in a nutshell, is my lifelong experience of racism. I choose to tell this story tonight because it happened at the dinner table of a good Catholic family, as my mother would say. The devotion of regular rosaries and daily mass attendance did not save this family from being blind to the casual ways racism caused them to deny the truth of the gospel and our shared human dignity as children of God. This experience, as painful as it was then and is now even, to remember, has been instructive. I can't help that family, but I can be more thoughtful about how I put my own faith commitments into practice, particularly when they run counter to systems, practices, and behaviors that try to normalize the supremacy and dominance of some over those who are supposed to be their brothers and sisters in Christ.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. For me, it was really important that we read at Holy Cross Father Massingale's book this year to help us better understand not only the racism of the Catholic Church, but really I was hoping it might help us to understand the racism that exists on our campus. The way that normative whiteness serves as a form of idolatry at Holy Cross, completely betraying who we are and who we claim to be as an institution. The story I want to share with you today, though, is not to help us understand the institutional ways in which racism functions at Holy Cross, but the ways it functions in people who think that they're not racist, myself included, or who thought they were not. My first year at Holy Cross, I lived in Bevan, which back in 1980 was a small dorm with a sense of community on the floor that was very strong. There were only about 40 of us on that floor, and I found it pretty easy to get to know people, and I felt like we were in a pretty fun and happy place. We called it Bevan Heaven. However, over time, on the floor, it seemed to be two cliques started to form, and what had been this really exciting, wonderful place to be started to feel like the worst parts of high school. I was not alone in feeling that way. So a few of us called an informal meeting of the women on our floor. We wanted to talk about how to get past the clickiness and try to make things a little bit more of a welcome space that we had experienced initially. Bevan was a very old dorm, so it had nice, big, wide hallways where everyone could fit and sit together. And so we gathered around. And when everyone was sitting there, I started to share my observations about our once very welcoming hall starting to feel divisive and cliquey. After I finished speaking, a girl on the edge of the group spoke up. "You're wrong about Bevan," she said. "It wasn't once welcoming and now divided in two," she corrected me. There are actually 3 groups on our floor now, and some of us never felt a part of the first group to begin with. The student speaking was my next door neighbor. I blanched. I knew immediately she was right, even though prior to that moment, I had not seen what was perfectly obvious to her and to the 2 other Black students who were living in the room next to mine. When I came to Holy Cross as a first-year student, I did not think I was racist. In fact, I had grown up in the 60s and 70s, and I was excited and energized by the civil rights movement. I was inspired by my dad's story of participating in a sit-in at Woolworth's lunch counter to try to advocate in the 1950s for desegregating the restaurant. I counted people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King as some of the heroes, people I wanted to emulate in my life. And yet when I thought the hall was divided into 2 groups, I did not notice that the Black students were in neither group. As I share this story, I still feel a lot of shame. It happened 40 years ago, and I'm still growing in my understanding of what all the dynamics were that shaped my actions. But to me, it feels very much like a Holy Cross story that could happen today and any other day on this campus. And that's why I felt it was important to share, in hopes that we might have a better sense of what racism looks like on our campus.
Thank you both, Michele and Marybeth, for your courage and your compassion in sharing those personal stories and helping us come to a deeper understanding of why we need to have this conversation and why we need to have it now. So thank you. I'm deeply appreciative, and I'm sure the participants are as well. We'll shift gears a little bit now into inviting the panelists to share some thoughts on the book and the thoughts and emotions that were evoked as part of reading the book. So my first question to the panelists is that Father Massingale references the 4 R's, the recognition, responsibility, reconstructions, and reparations. And I'd love the participants to take one or more of those themes to offer some opening reflections. And we're gonna start with Professor Mary Roche first.
Great, thank you, thanks. And since I'm starting off, I think just want to also highlight that when Bryan Massingale is talking about these 4 R's, he's drawing on the work of another scholar, Yamamoto, Professor Yamamoto, who is a legal scholar, but is one who worked and advocates. So he was a scholar, sort of advocate and activist for seeking reparation for the Japanese who had been interned during World War II and had success in the court on that. So I think it adds, knowing a little bit of that adds to some of the conversation. When I look at those 4 R's and I think about, in some ways they're not sort of linear, like first you go to recognition and then you can look at responsibility, right? But they're always in a dynamic kind of conversation with each other. And even as you move toward reconstruction, reparation, there's always an invitation to deeper recognition of the humanity of another person. So we're always kind of returning and hopefully getting deeper and deeper. The one that I wanted to kind of stay with, and I thought that this was, in some ways really fitting too for Ash Wednesday, was responsibility, right? And Massingale in the book, when he talks about responsibility, talks about the assessment of group agency, right? And group sort of responsibility for racism. And I think a lot of times we think about personal responsibility for things. And again, I'm speaking as a white woman, and I think what I'm sharing is sort of directed at my white fellow alumni, right? Is that that personal, if we feel disconnected from that, right? If we can sort of feel like we say, well, I have never used a racial slur, or I have, right? And as Marybeth has sort of illustrated, there are ways in which we are part of the racist system that sometimes we are unaware of. But sometimes I think the really kind of confronting both our personal and group responsibility. And if we are white, we have responsibility. We have responsibility, even though we may feel distant from it, to sort of say, well, this is generations ago, or this is other people. We still really have to confront that. And I think that Massingale really does this quite just beautifully and provocatively. But one of the things that it requires, right, is being able to be present to rage, right? The anger that Michele was just speaking about, and the rage expressed quite forcefully, and to be able to sort of to face that, to sit with it, to absorb it in some level, right? And think about where my responsibility is, where my personal responsibility is, how as I sort of spell out all of my engagements in the world and how I'm participating. So to really to be able to do that, right? It is really hard to sit with somebody's anger. It's very hard, it's scary. But I think one of the things about the readings that we had on Ash Wednesday for folks who, observe this day, that Joel is even now, it's not too late. God is calling, God is present. And so one of the things that I take from the book is that this is really uncomfortable, and uncomfortable really doesn't begin to sort of capture it, but it's challenging, but it has to be done. And to face the shame, to face other people's righteous anger in the work of justice is vital. You will survive that. And if we don't do it, there are other people, Black men, Black women, Black queer folks, who will not survive, right? As the choir so beautifully conveyed in the materials, right? So to really kind of step into responsibility. And in our Ignatian tradition, which Bryan Massingale also relies on, the sense in which we are sinners who are loved, that even now, even when we confront that shame, even when we confront the rage, that God has not abandoned us, right? One thing that I'll just sort of really say is that there's something to be, people who are in the Holy Cross community who are absolutely entitled to righteous anger and rage, who are somehow open to accompanying the rest of us in that. So we don't have to be scared, right, of that moment, because if we don't face it with courage, then the fear that is just sort of controlling our culture right now gets the last word. And that's what I have to share.
Thank you very much, Mary. Next, I think we'll go to Dean Murray.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for that. I also have to thank Mary because she offered that to the group earlier that the readings for today for Ash Wednesday really are very helpful. And so I went back to them and I found that they were very helpful to me in terms of what I wanted to share. In reading Massingale's book, and particularly the section on the 4 R's, I found myself not being able to get past the first R of recognition. And in part, I want to say thank you to all of you who have joined this session tonight, who have joined the reading group, because that to me is a demonstration of recognition. And recognition in terms of the sin of racism, and that is what I will call it. I think that's what it is. It's a collective and personal sin. Recognition is so deeply, for me, the very first step. And I find myself daily in a society that refuses to recognize. And so I as I was reading, I really could not get past the first R. As a sort of aside, next month I will have the opportunity to spend a little bit of time virtually with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the founder of the 1619 Project. And I'll have the opportunity to interview her. And my number one burning question is, what keeps you going when you are trying to help us as a nation face our past and all of the insults that are being hurled at you? I'm speaking to you like you are she. Those insults are about people refusing to recognize, people refusing to acknowledge the truth of our past and how it lives in our present. And I see the 1619 Project as a really important step for preparing a different future. And so I'm dismayed when people refuse to recognize. Now you understand why I really couldn't get past the first star, because that's the space where I'm living right now. And when I went back to, thanks again to Mary, to the readings for today, the responsorial psalm, it is right there. I mean, it is, be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned. For anybody to even be able to say that means that they recognize, whether it's the personal or the collective, distance that they've put between themselves and God. And so I am struggling. I am struggling with how do we move forward if we have not all of our nation, but a good part of it that just refuses. And so I'll try to end on a hopeful note. Otherwise, this would be very hard. And my hopeful note is that we're having this event at all. And my hopeful note is not just one person signed up, but 200 some odd alums who I'm sure you all have better things to do on a Wednesday evening, but this is where you chose to be. And that to me is a sign that recognition is possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele, for those thoughtful comments. I'll invite Alex next to offer some thoughts.
So I want to tell a story about my beloved partner, Kara, who's class of '85, and I were preparing to adopt, and this is back in the mid-1990s. And the story I want to tell is a story, it's about taking up responsibility, but it's also about, it's kind of a moment in time where you can see what Bryan Massingale is talking about in terms of the relationship between normative whiteness and anti-Blackness in our society. And also, it was a time when we were really confronted with having to unlearn whiteness and learn how to celebrate and join in the struggle of Black lives. And so what happened was, I was attending a Catholic Charities adoption agency presentation, preparing people for adoption. And the director gave this presentation in which she very matter-of-factly presented a hierarchy of preferred babies to adopt by white people. And at the top of that hierarchy was white, healthy babies. And then second was Russian, and then East European, and then Asian, and then Latino, and then babies who are disabled. And at the very bottom, she just very matter-of-factly said, are Black babies. Black healthy babies are at the very bottom of a hierarchy of preferred children by white parents. So, and at that time, Kara and I had been members of a Black Catholic community. And so I was really, it was a very painful moment to see where society looks at our Black brothers and sisters. But then also what I was also struck by that Bryan talks about in his book is that Blackness is viewed as, I mean, this is where intersection comes in of ableism and anti-Blackness. That Blackness is viewed as less than able. And something that I wish we had hours to talk about this, but that history has a 500-year history. And the church is deeply implicated in the history of creating that hierarchy and being complicit in creating a society of anti-Blackness. And so in that context, when we were considering to adopt cross-racially, we also knew that from the National Association of Black Social Workers that they were against white parents adopting African-American children, and for very good reason. So this was a time that we were confronted with our own privilege, our own sense of innocence, our own sense of, that we're just good, and because our goodness can take on anything in the world. And I have to say, and many of you know, Kara and I we have two beautiful biracial African-American children. And I completely agree with I very much agree with the National Association of Social Workers. But at that time, what we were confronted with also is the reality of how death is a threat. It's a threat always at every moment. And death is a threat that is structured into our society. So how are we as white people going to deal with that? How could we possibly parent in this context? So what everyone said to us are, people at the parish and other parents who had adopted cross-racially, is that we would have to take up anti-racism as a way of life. We would have to begin to unlearn our own assumptions as white people. We would have to begin to unlearn our own sense of goodness, of innocence, that we can do no wrong. And also to engage in a struggle for Black lives. And so in order to do that, that really meant taking up anti-racism as a way of parenting, doing that interpersonally, doing that institutionally, and doing that in terms of public policy. So that kind of brings together several of the 4 R's, and it's a place of conflict that Bryan invites us to enter and to be present with Christ in that conflict this Lent.
Thank you for that very powerful story, Alex. Really appreciate it. I want to bring us back to how do we think about race, racism, and anti-racism within using the tools that the faith tradition provides us. So Father Massingale references lament and compassion as some key elements of the Catholic faith, and I'd like to invite the panelists to reflect on how these concepts might intersect with our work to end racism.
The thing that really struck me in both Father Massingale's book and then in the interview or article rather that he had in NCR back in June of 2020 was the place he placed on prayer for helping us to address racism and white supremacy in a way that helps us to get beyond the rational and enter into the place of the heart and the deep core of who we are. And the thing he says is racism is a political issue and a social divide, but at its deepest level, racism is a soul sickness. Talks about it as a warping of the human spirit. These are like really deep terms that I think get at it better than anything I can think of. And he talks about the importance of contemplation in this. And he actually cites an article that by a woman named Constance Fitzgerald that I recommend to all of you. It's very powerful. And it helps to understand the power of contemplation. But just to put it in our Ignatian tradition, I began to think about the way the spiritual exercises call us to contemplation, to really put our memory, our desire, and our will in a place of being able to be transformed, where we're asked to put on the mind of Christ and to see the world through God's eyes and experience God's dream as having an expression in our hearts and in our lives. And so I thought a little bit about if we were to pray to see racism and white supremacy through God's eyes in an Ignatian lens, like what would that look like? And I can imagine having to ask questions like, how does God feel as a police officer kneels on George Floyd's neck?
Mm-hmm.
Am I willing to go to the scene and bear witness, to watch, to listen, to smell, to taste, and to feel what's going on in that moment? Can I sit with what happens inside of me when I watch that video that captures the murder of George Floyd by so-called public servants? And then can I recognize this scene as bringing me to the foot of the cross? To ask the question, what is the connection between the privileges white supremacy has afforded me and the terror that Black people live with when confronted by law enforcement? And how does God invite me to respond to this awareness? And can I let God inhabit my being and guide that response? And what do I have to let go of for this to happen? And what am I afraid of as I consider this invitation? And this is, I think, the kind, at least when I try to confront this, these are the kinds of questions that I feel like are at the core of trying to help address this as a soul sickness. And this is right out of the tradition that we supposedly embrace at Holy Cross. And so I think it's a resource we need to be engaging with more. And I think this kind of contemplation inevitably leads us to lament, because you can't sit with that scene and place yourself there in an Ignatian way and not start to scream, to not cry out at that like deep guttural level. And I think while the prayer I started with was obviously an African-American person crying out in that very voice. And I'll leave that to others to talk about what that means for the African-American person to be able to access lament. But for a white person, I think it helps me at least to face one of the big mistakes that I find I make in facing racism in my own heart and on our campus, which is to think of it as like, this is something I have to figure out how to fix and address. And while I certainly have to do some of that work, I often find that kind of leaves me feeling paralyzed by the pervasiveness and perniciousness of it. And that leaves me overwhelmed, and I don't move forward the way I want to. But I think laments allow us to confess our role, and they set me straight about two things. First, that I'm a part of a lamenting community, and second, that the lamenting community is dependent on God. And that when I can recognize that my dependence on God in this moment, that the idol of white supremacy gets displaced, because you can't have white supremacy as your idol and God at the same time. I think those two don't go hand in hand. So that's where I feel like we have resources in our tradition that can help us here. And I really hope our community can see that and not be afraid of this, but to really kind of go into it, trusting that we do this with God's help. I know that means a lot to me.
Thank you for that. See if any of the other panelists are interested in offering any thoughts on lament and compassion, or any other tools that are based in the Catholic faith tradition in particular that can be useful in our collective work to end racism.
Just one thing again to kind of follow up on what Marybeth's just so beautifully described lament, and lament as always sort of resting in like the Psalms of lament somehow end in hope or utter sort of reliance on God. And I think one of the things that's been helpful to me is reading Bryan Massingale, but reading Bryan Massingale along with a number of other writers that Amit and Casey Catlett and everyone at OME have introduced me to. Because one of the things I sort of struggled with is there's another book that we've read called Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper, and a number of people. And I think one of the things I'm alert to, right, is that sometimes people of white and with privilege can kind of enter into a kind of lament that's sort of woe is me, and you do get to that sort of paralyzed feeling. And I think it's also what I was saying before about it being kind of an uncomfortable place. So for me, what's been really important and helpful is to really listen to the laments of other folks, and the laments that arise from people like Brittany Cooper, that arise in the choir, right, singing the last 7 last words, and to really, really attend to that, I think is also important, and the practice of communal lament. One of the things that Bryan Massingale years and years ago in a lecture reminded me, as Catholics, we have the sacrament of reconciliation, and here the reconciliation isn't going to happen at the end of the service, right? You're really in for a long journey. But he also said, that even though this is a soul sickness, and this is right, that this is about our sort of interior motivations, there also comes a time when you have to sort of say, as people did in the history of confession, here's who I am, here's my status, my place in the world, and here's what I've done and didn't do, how many times I did. It sort of can sound a little trite, like we've moved away from confession where I say I did this 6 times and I did that, and then I will do 10 Hail Marys or whatever it is. But not to lose that, right? Not to get sort of really very concrete, as much as you can about how you're involved in this. But I find that if I am left to my contemplation or my lament by myself, it's going to be impoverished if I'm not paying attention to others.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mary. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, and we did receive a number of questions during the registration period from the alumni who signed up for the webinar. So I apologize that we don't have enough time to probably get to every single question, and I see some questions coming in on the chat as well. But let's start with one of the questions that was submitted in the registration period. How do you recognize the difference between performative anti-racist efforts and those that are really effective and inclusive?
Yeah, so I started to talk about that a little bit. I think what's really key is how do we enter into communal and collaborative relationships. So for me, one really key moment for me when I started working in New Orleans was joining a community organizers anti-racism roundtable. And the model of that roundtable, I think, is a really excellent model for anti-racism because it was led by women of color, and but everyone is welcomed, and so I think that kind of approach, where we're part of a community that's working together for and we were working toward specific like public policy goals and community organizing, but it's also a way of listening and being attentive to key concerns of a particular community. And so that context, I think, is really key to begin to think about that question.
I think too on this, the performative justice, again, I reflecting on this and hearing the readings today and the gospel reading hit me in a very different way. You know, the gospel today talks about, you know, on a day when people will put ashes on their forehead and be very sort of public about a moment of repentance, right? That the gospel is somehow saying, don't let anybody know that you're doing that. Don't let anybody know that you're doing that. Do that in secret. You know, I think, you know, my colleagues know that you see me anywhere, I've got some sort of button or ribbon or, you know, whatever, right? I think that, I think those things are still important, right? It's a way of somehow signaling to people something about what I value and what I'm committed to. But the key thing, I think, is sort of taking that to the next step of, well, what risk am I willing to take because I'm wearing the button or the ribbon, or I've attended something, but also being willing to be sort of called out, right? That's another part of, you know, wearing my rainbow ribbon or something, is that I'm also trying to say that when I mess up or I need to do more or I need to do differently, you can call me on that. And I think that that's really important. I think in some ways it is for, you know, other folks to sort of say whether or not my performative is inconsistent, right? Because I think one of the things that is I struggle with in the church, right, is that this is all such a very low priority for our church. And it's sort of, our church can perform a number of things and say a number of things, but it is so bound to white supremacy and patriarchy and this intersection there that it's really hard to get past, I think, some of that performative work. But the sense in which there are some times in which the justice and the solidarity needs to happen in secret sometimes, and I can't boast about it. And I can't put a banner about it without making more people vulnerable, right? I think this is something we've struggled with DACA students, right? We want to be very visible in a lot of solidarity, but we also know that we can bumble into something that creates more danger for people. And so again, I think the community is really so vital there.
Thank you for that. It lends, so you referenced a little bit to the role of the church in addressing race and racism. So one of the questions that came in was, should priests discuss the issue of race and racism in their weekly homilies?
Of course.
Yeah.
So maybe the second part of that is then how, like, you know, what are the barriers that are, because I don't get the sense that it is happening universally. I absolutely know that I moved here from Syracuse, and the, Father Fred there was very upfront in bringing this issue in, for which he got a lot of flack, if I'm being honest, right? There were some people who were not on board. So if you could say a little bit more about, like, yes, they should, and like, how do you move past the barriers to having those discussions?
Wow. I don't think they're real barriers. I think those are that's called cowardice. And I feel very strongly that we have an obligation to apply the gospel to our lives and to the world around us. And if this is one of the central sins of our day, of course we should be talking about it. How do you lead people to God if you won't talk about the thing that's standing in the way?
Yeah, and if I can build on that, I would say that, for people on this webinar, you can organize parishes in your local community to take up anti-racism training and include priests, invite your bishop. Priests have to learn and also unlearn their own biases as well. And I think that's one of the problems of the church, and one of the problems that Bryan pinpoints in his analysis is that the church lacks passion, and it lacks passion because it's not involved at the cross. It's not at the cross where racism happens in our society. And so this Lent, I think there's just a really urgent call from God at this time for us to begin to take steps with Black Lives Matter, DACA students, many different communities, to enter into walking with them in the way of the cross. And that includes inviting priests into that process so that they too can learn and ground themselves in a way where they can become passionate and articulate about proclaiming the gospel in a very grounded way.
I think if I could add to this, and this is, a little personal, but it has become very important for me when I'm looking for a parish home to be able to trust the community, that I can be a part of it, that my family can be a part of it, and that the pastor of that community can be as much a pastor to me as to whoever it is sitting next to me. And I have fired churches, so to speak, for not being what I need them to be. And, I'm very well aware that people who are avowed religious are human beings too, and all of the rest of it. And so I don't believe that I hold anybody to a higher standard than I would hold myself to, or anybody else. But there is a responsibility in leading a community to understand God, or to draw closer to God, to have an expression of faith. And if that expression, as I have found in my life, or what's being taught or promoted, or however you say it, is in conflict with what I can read my own self in the gospel, then it's time for me to find another community. Mm-hmm. And I'm also not silent about that, right? So I don't slink away in the dark. And it's not like this happens all the time. This has happened once in my life. But I let the people know why I was leaving. And then I leave that to them and their own relationship with God to figure that one out. But I have to be nourished. And I think that as members of faith communities, we deserve that. Mm-hmm. And we can demand that of our leaders.
Thank you for that, Michele. I am conscious of time, and I really want to get to this question because we know that dealing with racism and knowing how pervasive it is and how it's intertwined in so many different systems in our society, it can be really overwhelming, right? And that impact is different on Black, Indigenous people of color than maybe white people, but it is still, nonetheless, it is overwhelming. So in order to keep going, you have to find some moments of hope, faith, the ability to continue. So the question that came in, it really resonated with me, was, where do you see hope today? Or where do you find your own hope to continue the struggle for anti-racism?
I find hope in all of the Black Catholic parishes that we've been members of. I mean, the witness of the Black Catholic community is very powerful in the United States. To me, it's a very deep sign of hope and love and transformation. So that's what has really been critical for us. Marybeth.
For me, it's been a lot of conversations that are happening at Holy Cross right now that have been very encouraging, to be part of the anti-racism trainings and things done by OME and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office, to have our office have the opportunity to partner. Those are all been really hopeful for me. And I can't get out of my head that song about the welcome table that's in Massingale's book. I absolutely love I'm going to sit at this table, and that sense that somebody who has been so pushed aside and given every message that says you don't belong knows in their soul that they do is hugely hopeful to me. So that woman singing that, so I went and looked it up, I heard a woman sing it, and I just can't stop thinking about that. So for me, that's the image.
For me, definitely our students. I am given hope and a lot of consolation, and because they're challenging me so much all the time. Students who are just with wonderful power and beauty are elbowing their way to the table. And really doing some remarkable things to call us out as a community.
And I'll just close out the panel on this question by saying that I find hope no matter where I am in this one thing, one truth, that at the end of the day, love wins. At the end of the day, love wins. And I know that to be true in my heart of hearts, in the deepest parts of my soul. And my job is to play my part, is to do the thing that I can do, and try not to be distracted or overwhelmed by the things that I cannot take on. Because at the end of the day, love wins. So that's where I find hope.
Thank you so much. We are at our closing time. I'm going to invite Alex to lead us through. We started with an opening prayer. We're going to lead with some closing thoughts here as well. So, Alex.
So this is a selection from the youth poet laureate Amanda Gorman, her poem, "The Hill We Climb." So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? Will we not march back to what was, but move to what shall be? A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free? We will not be turned around. or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left with.
Thank you so much, Alex. We hope that this conversation has been helpful for you. I really want to thank our panelists who courageously shared their own stories, their thoughts, and invited the presence of God in helping us move through these difficult conversations. What our hope is that you feel inspired by it. We are going to, in a couple, we have recorded this event. We will get it captioned and we will post it to the college's website. We will send an email to everybody who registered for this event if you want to look over the conversation again, or if you want to, you know, you've read the book, if you want to invite your family members, people of your faith community, people in your workplace, people in nonprofit organizations that you volunteer with, go spread the love, right? Use the tools that we've provided. And if you want to use this recording, you're more than welcome to do that as well. I do want to share that there's a couple of other resources that we will send in the follow-up email. One of them being the anti-racism retreat called No Justice, No Peace, KNOW. No Justice, but also No Justice, No Peace. It's a Jesuit anti-racism retreat that we encourage folks to take a look at. Also, the college has developed a self-paced anti-racism action planning guidebook. If you wanna, so it's good for us to talk about these things, but now we have to put our faith, our values into action. So it's a free resource. We'll make that available to you through the follow-up email. If you want to, again, do it by yourself or do it in community with others, the point being that we want you to, we hope that you are moved to action. The time is now, the call is now. So thank you so much again, everybody, for being here. Thank you again to my wonderful panelists. I'm in deep awe and gratitude for your ability to share so clearly and to call us to action. So thank you for that. With that, I think we'll say good night and wish you all well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.